Welcome to the audio lecture on Chinese and Korean art and culture after the year 1279. What we're looking at here is a photo that really illustrates the juxtaposition between the old and the new in today's modern China, between the revolutionary and the traditional, and between the traditional and the commerce. This is from the Shanghai Hotel, and it's simply a picture of two workers as they're hanging an art show. Let's stay in the contemporary art world for just a minute, and I'd like to share with you one of my very favorite artists, really of all time, and to talk about art in general for a moment. It is my hope that with these lectures, all of you who are listening will be inspired to look at art more deeply and to maybe further your study of art by exploring artists that are interesting to you. This is the artist Hung Liu, and I first saw her work at the Kemper Museum in Kansas City. One thing that's important to note about this work, and one thing, this thing really speaks to the power of seeing artwork in person. This piece is about 12 feet long, and I'd say 7 feet tall. So when you see it in person, it is so powerfully moving. I guess really the image speaks for itself. Here's two more works by this contemporary artist. This one is called By the River of Babylon. Note how the artist uses a combination of realism and abstraction, and I would say that this is one of my favorite aspects of her work, because we have the detailed realism with almost an academic precision of the figures, and then the backgrounds tend to go into drips and abstract patterns, which actually really adds a quality to her work. I'd also like you to note the use of color, where the figures have muted tones and yet their environment is bright colors. Look at the boy's bowl and how that compares to the colors of the figure itself. These are all things that the artist does when they take a chance, when they break the rules of art. And in this case, it's really ended up, the result has been some very strong work. So we're going to look at one more. This is such a beautiful piece. It's so moving, and it just speaks to what happens in old age for really across the cultures. These are cranes, and they represent wisdom. They also represent peace. And they also, of course, one could have the idea that clear thought is getting more difficult as this person ages. So now we'll go back in time and look at traditional Chinese painting, which was a rich tradition for really thousands of years. Speaking of thousand, this painting is called A Thousand Peaks and Myriad Ravines, and on it the artist wrote the following poem. Moss and weeds cover the rocks, and mist hovers over the water. The sound of dripping water is heard in front of the temple gate. Through 1,000 peaks and myriad ravines the spring flows and brings the flying flowers into the sacred caves. In the 4th month of the year 1693, in an inn in the capital, I painted this based on a Tang Dynasty poem in the manner of the painters Dong Yuan and Zhu Ran. So here we have an example of what we would call literati painting. And this artist is referring back to the scholars that have come in the lineage before him. There was an ideal in the scholarly class, beginning with the Tang and really traced back to earlier times. Students in China, really male students, had to undergo rigorous exams, and really most of them failed. But these, for the few that did pass these extremely difficult civil service exams, they really had quite a prestigious life. They had position, power, wealth, and really had the highest position in society. They're called the literati of ancient China, literati. And in this class, they did a kind of a unusual blending of the Confucianism ideal, which would mean that they would have official government positions, blended with the Taoist ideology, which meant that many of the literati would compose poems, make beautiful gardens, and really explore the art of painting. Now, this blending of you could say the poetic side and the side of duty is really kind of unique in China and has carried forth in some ways to this day. In the year 1279, the mighty warrior Genghis Khan came down south from Mongolia and swept through China into Western Europe and into the Islamic states as well. And this caused great upheaval in China to the status quo. At this time, China had already been going internal, rejecting outside influences and holding itself as being a unique and separate culture from the rest of the world. And many Chinese viewed the Mongols as sort of barbarians, and it strengthened their sense of their own culture, and it's even furthered this separation. Now, in the early days, the painters in China were part of the imperial court. They held a high position in court, and so they could really kind of do what they want. They were supported as artists, and so they could experiment and try new things, and they really carried the art to a very high level. Now, when when the Mongols took over, they abolished the state exams, and there became to be a separation between the art of the court, which was decorative and really at the service of the king and produced some very great art, and the art of the literati, which was the art of the poet, the art of the artist who cared less about being accepted by the masses and cared more about exploring really the finer points of their art. Let's talk for a moment about Marco Polo. There was the great Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, and he expanded the Mongol Empire to the edges of Hungary and Poland. And so what happened was that there was a land route open from Europe all the way to China. And this young man, Marco Polo, was still a teenager when he set out with his uncle and his father to go to China to deliver a letter from the Pope to Kublai Khan. When they arrived in Beijing 4 years later, they were really amazed at the wonders of what they saw. And the young Marco Polo became a favorite of the emperor, and he remained in his service for 17 years. During that time, he traveled extensively all over China and finally returned back to his home in the year 1295. So there was a war between Genoa and Venice, and Marco Polo was imprisoned as an older man. And to pass the time, he told stories of his adventures to a fellow cellmate who wrote them down. And this became the very famous book, A Description of the World, which really opened China to Europeans and has remained a favorite, a much-read book since that time. And what of the Chinese art that Marco Polo found in his time in China? Well, here we have a painting by Zhao Mengfu called Autumn Colors on the Cao and Hua Mountains. This was painted actually for a friend to commemorate the friend's homeland. What's important to note here is that this particular artist was actually part of the Mongol court, unlike many of the artists that chose to go a different route and eschew the court. And he was very famous for painting horses. But what he's done here is he's reverted back to a historic painting style. So he's honoring the style of his ancestors through this painting. And this is also true of our next painting by Nizan, who really honored the earlier painting. What I'd like you to note here is the dry brush style. In dry brush painting, you don't load your brush with ink. Instead, you just have a little bit on it. And in dry brush technique, you kind of draw with the brush. And this is a great technique for any artist from history or contemporary to play with, because it gives you so much control when you just have a small amount of ink on the brush. And the artist gets to decide, do you want to use a stiffer brush, which can actually have a little bit, make the job a little bit simpler, or a soft brush, as was probably done here. This dry style, this simple style, it supposedly reflects the character and the personality of the person who painted it, which is what the literati painters believed, and that makes sense, that the art would reflect the artist, right? Well, this guy, Nizan, he became quite wealthy working in the courts, and he actually had large estates and was very eccentric. In fact, he was so clean that not only did he bathe himself several times a day, but according to the stories, he demanded that people who worked for him clean the trees on his estate. So, according to legend, later in life, he just left all of that behind and became a wandering hermit, just wandering and writing poetry. So whether or not these stories are true, they do reflect the mythology of the literati caste, which are both working in society, amassing great wealth as part of government, and then taking the road of the Taoist monk and just wandering out in the world, being a part of nature and reflecting that through poetry and art. In 1368, the Mongols were overthrown and the Ming dynasty started. And the soldier who became emperor in the Ming dynasty came from a poor peasant background. And as he was rising in the ranks in the army, he enlisted the help of the literati, and he asked scholars for advice. But eventually, when he became emperor, he grew to distrust those with maybe with more education than him. And actually the literati became alienated, and there still remained that separate class of the artists, intellectuals, and those who served in the court. One thing that the leader, the emperor of the Ming dynasty, did do was reinstate these exams, which created which really reinforced the literati class. And here we have a painting from the Ming Dynasty, probably from the court, and it's got some symbolic meaning. Hundreds of birds admiring the peacocks. So what this is said to mean, well, first let's look at the school. It's from the school of flower and bird paintings. Pretty obvious. But the hundreds of birds would be the courtiers who are there to admire and flatter the imperial emperors and as part of the court intrigue and one could say in modern terms perhaps the dysfunction of the court as is put forth by this artist. So this next piece done in the same era by Dai Jin is really notable mostly in that it became a model for Korean and Japanese artists that followed. As we wind our way through the ancient tradition of Chinese painting, let's look at yet another from the Ming Dynasty. This is Qi Ying. And one thing that's notable about this artist is that, as in earlier artists, he studied work that was much older than him from around the year 220 and copied the style, the earlier style of depicting the court. Another thing to note about this is that it's a hand scroll, so it's designed to be seen by rolling and unrolling rather than looked at as a whole. But this artist came to be seen as a master of this style of painting and was really copied by many artists that came after. Well, now that we've looked at all those paintings, let's consider how they created the pieces, how they displayed them also. So, except for the very large banners hung in imperial palaces, most Chinese paintings were painted with ink and a water-based pigment on either silk or on paper. There was three main ways that they did their paintings. We have hand scrolls, which you see on the left, hanging scrolls, which you see on the right, and leaves in an album, which is basically pages in a book. And with the hand scroll, they're actually showing you here a couple that could also have been leaves from an album. But generally, the hand scrolls were all painted as a piece. Now, if you think about it, creating these scrolls, or either the hand scrolls or the hanging scrolls, was a rather exacting process, as they had to be mounted on silk, they had to hang appropriately, and everything needed to be done in a meticulous manner. And I've actually worked on repairing some of these historic scrolls, and they're quite delicate and quite beautiful, really. So the hand scrolls were not really designed to be viewed all at once. The viewer rather was supposed to roll through them, rolling up one end and unrolling the other side in order to get the full story. And the hanging scrolls, they were depicting the entire painting. But both of these were not intended to be hung all the time, but only to be hung up for really for special occasions. In addition to painting, the Ming Dynasty became known worldwide for the exquisite china. In particular, the porcelain, this blue and white porcelain as we see here. There was one particular province that was called Jiangxi province, and they were known for the finest porcelain of all. And you know, if you go to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, they have an exquisite collection of both Chinese painting and porcelain, as well as some of the early bronze vessels that we saw in the study of early China. And here's an example of the Ming porcelain here. So now let's look at the Forbidden City, which was developed during the Ming Dynasty. The city of Beijing was the capital for the Mongols first, and they really developed it as far as city planning. They made street grids. There was a part of the city that was reserved for the Mongols and a part that was lived in by the Chinese. Well, when the Ming took over, they preserved this separation. Only this time, the part that was reserved, there was part reserved for the common people and a part that was reserved for the imperials, and this was called the inner city. So here we have the Forbidden City that was built during the Ming Dynasty. And you can see at the bottom of the picture the entrance into the city. And you can see as you go down this courtyard, you then get into the interior palaces. Note also that it's surrounded by a moat, by water. So this is now a palace complex, and we'll look more at the Forbidden City in the films in this week's lesson. But you can see here it is truly an architectural wonder. And one of the other things that makes it really interesting is that most of the early architecture of China was lost because of all of the strife and the war that occurred, you know, throughout China's history. But here we have a prime example of early imperial architecture that's really been preserved to this day. So not only is the art of the literati reflected in painting and in garden design, it's also reflected in furniture. This particular piece is a fine example of literati design from the Ming Dynasty. And it also happens to be from the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. So I have actually seen this chair. Now there's several features about it that make it special, and many of them are hidden, but they're still nonetheless pretty extraordinary. There's no glue or adhesive used. The entire chair is put together using what we call mortise and tenon joints, which means the tenon is the thing that sticks out and the mortise is the hole that it fits into. And all of the wood that you see in the curved patterns, it's carved. It's not molded. It's not gotten wet and then formed into any shape. It's all carved into that pattern. And if you were to look at it closely, there's grains of the wood which really enhance the look of the chair. And it is remarkable really in its simplicity, but as you look closely, it's a really beautiful statement of a chair. Now, whether or not it would be comfortable to sit in, that's another matter. I think I'd probably just want to look at it as we're looking at it here. As we've already mentioned, the literati held the art of gardening in very high regard. And here we have the oldest example of a garden created by the literati. Now often they would surround their homes with these beautiful lush gardens. I like the name of this one. It's called The Garden of the Cessation of Official Life, or the Humble Administrator's Garden. So you can imagine this very educated man, this very educated man had served in an official capacity his whole life, and then he stopped that part of his life, and he retreated into the sort of the Taoist phase, really, where he could just be with nature, maybe write poems and paint and garden. So in this example, it's actually from an area in southern China that's called the Yangtze Delta, and it's where the most of these gardens really originated. And when you think about the climate, that really makes sense. So about a 1/3 of this area is given to water features, and then it's crisscrossed by pathways and corridors and pavilions and kiosks, all these different places where you could enjoy a different view of nature. You could be in the garden in a different way. Often they have very poetic names, like there's one called the Rain Listening Pavilion, or the Bridge of the Small Flying Rainbows. Looks like a nice place to hang out, eh? So in the late Ming Dynasty, there was a man named Dong Qichang, and he came up with some writing. He wrote and really kind of quantified literati painting in a way that's kind of interesting. He decided that there was to be a northern style and a southern style. Well, he wrote this in a great work that was considered a treatise on the painting. Now, a northern or southern painter didn't necessarily need to come from the north or the south. They more needed to follow the tradition of northern Zen, or Chan, as it's known in China, and southern Zen. So the southern style was really freewheeling, innovative, more expressing the feeling of the place itself, and maybe radical, really, for its day, whereas the northern style would be more conservative and refined and probably reflect traditional values. So in the northern style, what was most given most credence, most respected, was technical ability. And in the southern style, it would be your ability, the artist's ability to really express something in the moment with the paint. Now, this is a very interesting concept for a painter to explore, or for anyone to consider who's looking at art. Because, for example, think of a rock. A painting of a rock will never ever be a rock. So is the goal of the painter to duplicate the rock as accurately as a photograph would? Or rather is the goal of the painter to express something of the character of the rock? Therein lies a question that has been asked really throughout history, but is one of the questions that drove this separation. So you can remember the northern painters, more conservative, more concerned with technique. The southern painters, more free in their expression and more innovative. Now here we have a painting by Dong Qichang himself, and this is seen to be reflecting of the southern style. It's a little hard to see here in the slide, but he's very much flattened the perspective. So if you look at the foreground, there's a rock with a tree, and the background where the same shape of the rock is repeated in the distant mountains. They don't really seem to be as distant as they are really flattened. And what he's done instead is he's repeated these forms and shapes in a way that really is more reminiscent of calligraphy than of a traditional landscape painting. So this example here shows a little bit more conservative style of a painting of flowers and fruits from a whole album of flowers, bamboo, fruits, and vegetables, painted in the mid-1600s. This was a style of painting that was big in the imperial courts. Often the emperors themselves took up painting as a hobby. So here's an example of the other, more radical style. This one has an interesting story too. The artist Shi Tao was related to the emperors of the Ming Dynasty. And when that dynasty fell in the early 1600s and the Qing took over, he left and became a monk. He was kind of in disfavor, one could say. And so he took out all of this emotion in this painting here. And there's a small monk in a hut surrounded by jagged mountain peaks. So now we'll move on and look at the art of Korea. In the year 1392, General Yi in Korea overthrew the Goryeo dynasty, which had been in place for over 500 years. And he started what's called the Joseon dynasty and moved the capital to Seoul. As part of this transition, the Yi dynasty, the Joseons, they rejected Buddhism and instead adopted Neo-Confucianism as the state religion. And this kind of means, duty to state, following the rules rather than the practices of Buddhism. One of the things that came out of this time was something that's called bunchengware. And there's a long tradition of Korean ceramics, and it's both influenced by Chinese and Japanese, but it's also unique. One of the things that's also true about this particular time is that the Japanese were continuing to invade Korea. And so it was hard to keep their ceramics tradition going because the ceramics and the kilns were destroyed often by the Japanese invaders. This particular example of the Buncheng tradition shows, it's kind of rare because it shows a bird and a fish with this sort of calligraphic style. And this is actually a wine vessel. Now, much as the Ming ceramicists in China, the Korean ceramics artists really developed their own unique style of porcelain. Unlike the Chinese who painted the blue and white porcelain, the Korean artists used this kind of rust-colored glaze and created these exquisite patterns with the glazing as we see here. Another thing that's unique to Korean porcelain and ceramics in general is the shape of this vessel with the broad top and the narrow vase. Here we have one of the earliest remaining examples of Korean painting, and you can clearly see the Chinese influences here. It's actually based on a story by a Chinese Taoist called Dream Journey to the Peach Blossom Land. This is interesting because while it is clearly influenced by the Chinese art, in particular the Northern Song painters, it also is already developing a style that's uniquely Korean. Now, this idea of making art that was uniquely Korean was taken even further by this artist, Jang Shun. And he was part of a movement called Silak, or it was known as practical learning. What this meant was that, yes, the artists and the literati would study the Chinese classics, but they would also study what was uniquely Korean. This view is from some very famous mountains along the Korean coast called the Diamond Mountains, recognizable by people who are Korean. And not only did he render this well-known feature, environmental feature in Korea, he also did it in a style that is unique to the Korean painters, rather than copying Chinese styles as we saw in the earlier works. So here we have another example of this Silak in application in figurative form. Clearly these figures are not Chinese. They have a definite Korean influence in the dress and in the mannerisms, and they're actually playing, the musician is playing a traditional Korean zither. So here we have two examples of how Korean art developed in its own unique way apart from the Chinese influences. So during the Joseon dynasty and after, Korea was known as the Hermit Kingdom. It was really isolated from the rest of the world except for China. And this meant that artists there didn't really have the influences of the rest of the world. Now, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Korea was conquered by Japan, and then there was World War II. So it really continued to have a lot of isolationist tendencies. However, there were a few artists that managed to study modern painters, and this one, Kim Hwang-gi, was among them. He made it to Paris to study the minimalists and all of the artists that were really creating the modern art of the 20th century. And here's an example of a piece of his that really draws on the patterning and some of the calligraphic tradition that we see in Korean and Chinese art, but expresses it in a way that is really obviously modern. One thing you can see here in this modern piece is a certain kind of a refinement that we do see in a lot of the art from China and Korea. So this brings the audio lecture on the art of China and Korea after 1279 to a close. And as always, thanks so much for listening.